Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sefer Debarim, Perashat Debarim. We are starting a new book today. It's a very exciting, and in starting this new Sefer, maybe we should talk a minute about Sefer Debarim, just to get a sense of its genre and how it relates to the other Sefarim. Sefer Debarim is called Mishneh Torah. It's as if it is the second Torah or a copy of the Torah. And maybe they call it Mishneh Torah because many of the ideas that were presented previously are repeated here. There is a combination of law, of covenant. There's some rebuke, there's history. There's a lot that takes place in Sefer Devarim, but I think one of the most exciting and most interesting elements of the Sefer is that it is narrated by Moshe. Up until now, Moshe was speaking the words that God had given him, and that was the written Torah that we got. And now here in Sefer Devarim, we have a completely new dynamic. And in this dynamic, which is really, really groundbreaking, we have combined, incorporated in a Sefer that was predominantly God's voice, God's mandate, God's message. We have added to it as one. There's Chamisha Chumsheh, there's not 4 books and then this one. This is of equal importance, is the word of man, the word of Moshe. And what's exciting about it is it comes to us at the end of Moshe's life. The entire book takes place over the span of 1 month, tops. So all of Devarim is under 30 days, and we'll see it right in the first opening passages. It's a very short time span, but it covers a lot of ground. I think we should just go straight into it. Open your Chumashim, Perashat Debarim, Perek number 1. We're going to start with Pasuk 1, and we'll move from there. It starts with Ele Devarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael be'ever hayarden bamidbar ba'arava mul suf ben paran ben tofel velavan vechatzerot v'dizahav. It's not me, it's a long sentence. I don't think it's a run-on sentence. I think it was intended to be that way. One of the things that we start to sense when we open the book of Devarim is this idea of listing, and Moshe is Ele HaDevarim Asher Diber. The first thing we have is the concept of Dibur. We've discussed it in many classes before. Today I'm going to take hopefully under a minute to reiterate the importance of the word dibur as opposed to the word amira. Vayomer as opposed to vayidaber. And we said that the world that God created from above to below, all the energies that came from the heavens down to the earth came by way of amira. The entire first chapter, the first perek of Bereshit, where God is the creator, the only word used there is Amira. So Vayomer, Amira, is always very much connected with this idea of Bidiyut, of something that is created, that is something from nothing, that is Yesh Me'ayin. Literal creation of the world is described with Amira. That's how the first Sefer starts out. The last Sefer, which means that by now we've transitioned, there's been a transformation, humanity has been created, we have gone through a shared history. At this point, Sefer Devarim starts out with Ele HaDevarim Asher Diber. We transitioned from Amira, where all the energies are coming from above and things come into the world just by virtue of God's speech. As he spoke, things came into creation. Now we're preparing ourselves for a new reality in which dibur is going to govern the way the world operates. And what is dibur? If Amirah is God's speech, it was said in terms of a command. It was said as a one-way, we've used the word before, a monologue, where God is speaking, not expecting a response. Dibur is a dialogue. The word dibur, we had learned, first appears when Noah is told to step outside of the teva. Vaidaber, Hashem speaks to Noah and he tells him, Se min hateva. It's time for you now to be the initiator. It's time for you now to go out there. It's time for you to externalize yourself, so to speak, because God up until now has been the force that has been externalizing. Now with Noah, with the invention of the word dibur, what God wanted was for man to start now to take from his inside and come out. The word teva, which is beautiful since it's used with Vaidaber in Noah, teva also means a word, like Rashi Tevot, the heads of words. So a teva, tzemin hateva, is God's way of saying it's time for you not just to externalize and come out of the teva itself, out of the ark, but it's also time for you to master language. Not just language like the language that God speaks, which is a monologue, which is a one-way language. It's time for us to master the art of dialogue, which means being able to communicate, expecting your listener to be able to respond, making space, having pauses, formulating thoughts and ideas so that there could be a response to the monologue or whatever it is, to the dialogue. So when we just start out with Ele Debarim Asher Diber, we also sense a little tinge of irony, because we first meet Moshe in his earliest days, and he says, Lo ish Devarim Anochi. I am not a man of Devarim, and it is so fulfilling. As a reader of the text, I see my friends here will understand when I say we are Shepin Nachas, when we see that the man who was not an Ish Devarim suddenly becomes Mr. Author of a book called Devarim, and he is able to overcome his shortcomings, what he finds or feels are his deficiencies. Again, we want to get this sense that by the time we get to Sefer Devarim, it's a little bit like a graduation. We've already mastered so many skills. Moshe, our guide, has mastered and overcome his own personal deficiencies. So we start with Ele Hadevarim Asher Diber Moshe. You also get another beautiful sense. He's speaking El Kol Yisrael. It's very beautiful to see the words Kol Yisrael. We had never been called Kol Yisrael. This word Kol Yisrael, this terminology, if you're following in your Chumash, you'll see it's hyphenated. The Kol and the Yisrael come together as one, meaning first of all, the word Kol, Kila, Kilayon, Vayichulu, means a complete. So he's speaking, he's having a dialogue with all of Yisrael, with the entirety of Yisrael. And in previous classes, we had traced this phrase, Kol Yisrael, in the book of Devarim, which appears no less than 13 times. And we described what it means, what Kol Yisrael entails. How is it that we could wear this name like a badge of honor? What does Kol Yisrael mean? And every time we see Kol Yisrael mentioned in Sefer Debarim, another facet of our identity emerges. We have to be people who are caring. We have to be people who are laws. And it's a nice exercise for you guys to do on your own. For today, I want to spend a nice part of our time on these next few words, which are, so Moshe is speaking to Kol Yisrael, Be'ever HaYarden. He's speaking on the other side of the Yarden. Now, if we had a GPS, if we plugged in my current location in Waze, I don't know that they would describe our current location as being on the other side of the Jordan, in the desert, in the Arava, opposite Suf, between Paran and between Tofel and Lavan and Chatzerot and Dizahav. There are a lot of places being mentioned here. I had mentioned earlier, it looks very list oriented. And maybe on another day, we could look at this and say, at this point, Moshe is revealing to us from the way the Torah describes his geographic position that he has mastered his logical side, his left brain orientation is now at this point taking over. Whereas we had met him earlier at his earliest days when he was at the burning bush, he was fearful. He had an anxiety about the people not believing him, about Pharaoh not wanting to hear him, about his speech impediment. God literally has to give him a kick and get him out to go moving. And throughout our experience with Moshe, he becomes very emotional. He becomes emotional when the people complain. They complain about water, about bread, about food, about meat, about him. There are so many complaints that take place, and we see this emotional side of Moshe. And here now, by the time we get to Devarim, we start to experience a much more, what's the word that I'm looking for? You know, that left brain orient. He's looking in logically, and he's much more thoughtful as opposed to emotional. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But for now, I want to spend a little time talking about the where. Where are we? According to the first pasuk, I know for sure where we're not. All of the places that you mentioned, of all of them, the two elephants in the room would be Egypt and Israel. Those are the two main events. We leave Egypt and we're going to Eretz Yisrael. Everything else in between, all that space in between, is defined here as Ever Hayarden. We didn't cross the Jordan, we're on the other side of the Jordan. We're in the Midbar, and maybe the Midbar itself lends an image for us of where the Torah is taking us mentally and what Moshe wants to describe to us. So just last week, I started taking an art class. I know nothing about art. I don't know how to hold a paintbrush. I got yelled at for squeezing the paint tube straight onto the paper and not dipping and doing it. I'm not from the art people at all, but I just felt that it was a good thing to cultivate another side of my brain. And I look at black and white all day. I'm reading text. I said, so let's have a little fun with color. But I learned something very important on day one from this art class. The first thing that we were asked to do in the class was to draw outlines and to fill in those outlines that we drew, the color in the shapes, the main shapes got colored in. Of course, I'm thinking Egypt and Mitzrayim as I'm talking to you, because those are the main shapes that we would color in on this landscape if we were making a map, if we were charting the journey of the Israelites from the time they left Egypt to the end of Sefer Debarim. If you asked me to paint that, I would paint, I don't know, maybe Egypt in red. I'd paint Israel in beiges and blues and greens, excuse me. I don't know what I would do. I only went to one class, so I'm really not so great with colors yet, but I would have those two as my landmarks. And everything else in between, I changed my mind. Maybe I would do Israel with the flowing of milk and honey. Maybe, that was the imagery. And we're going to talk about a lot of that in this class because Moshe is going to speak to it. But in between Egypt and Israel, in this Eved Hayarden, in this Midbar place, in this space that isn't Egypt and isn't Israel, maybe it could be called negative space. Maybe that's the best way to describe the desert. It was negative space. It's the space that gets colored in last. It really isn't part of the picture. It's just in between the important represented images. So the space that isn't, I also read this weekend a magnificent book. I have it around here somewhere, I do. It's by Erica Brown. It's called Leadership in the Wilderness. Fantastic if you have the time to read it. I should have read it sooner while we were in Bimidbar, but I'm in Jersey and I found it in my house here, so I picked it up and I can't believe that I missed it, but it's always good to read whenever you can. Anyway, I wrote this down. She wrote beautiful. She wrote, the space that isn't defines the space that is. And that I thought was a really fantastic understanding. The space that isn't, the desert is a space that isn't. Nobody's having their mail forwarded to the desert. It's a space that isn't. It's an unnamed reality. And she calls it, that's the place between two familiar places. Our familiar places, Egypt, Israel, we're familiar with those. But this unnamed place it's not a tangible place. It's not a space. I bet you if you try to pinpoint your coordinates, you probably wouldn't even get a signal. You wouldn't even be able to chart where you were in this desert because it's what we would call a no man's land. And so I started to understand that this negative space, this area in the middle, it really, according now to the Torah, instead of it being a nothing and a wasteland and a no man's land, this Midbar, we have an entire Sefer named Bimidbar, for the Midbar. There's a purpose to that space. There's a purpose to this no man's land. There's a purpose to the transition. And I think the purpose for this Midbar that we experienced between Egypt and Israel is called here Eved Hayarden. The word Eved is a beautiful word because it's like ma'avar. A ma'avar is a bridge. It's a transition. It gets you from one place to the other. And in this place, in this space, we may have seen it up until now. Now, Moshe is the one who's been with us the entire stay in the desert. A lot of people died along the way, but the women and children, we believe most of them were there for the entire stay. And now, rather than have a view, when we get to Sefer Debarim, rather than say, boy, was that a waste of time. The truth, we could have gone from Egypt to Israel in the matter of a week and been done with it. The entire desert stay was one big waste of time. And Moshe is coming here to tell us, don't think of Eved Yarden, everything that happened on the other side of the Yarden, in the Midbar, in the Arava, in that whole area. That was not a waste of time. That had a purpose that you may not have understood at the time. I'm going to use an example that came to mind when I was reading this about wasted space or wasted time or meaningless or unnamed realities. Rabbi Natan Lopez is a wonderful rabbi. We need to mute. Yeah, is a wonderful rabbi that published a lot of books. But one of the things he wrote stuck with me forever. And he talks about the letters of the Sefer Torah. And in describing the letters of the Sefer Torah, he goes to a story that I believe was in the Gemara, where Moshe Rabbeinu was watching God put crowns and decorate the letters of the Sefer Torah. And Moshe asked God and said, how come the Torah that you gave me had plain, simple letters? For whom are you beautifying this Torah with all of these crowns? And Hashem answered him. He said, at the time, I think it was for Rabbi Akiva. I'm sorry if I'm botching up the story, but I'll give you the point of it. What God explained to Moshe is that, Moshe, you're seeing crowns and you think I'm beautifying the letters of your Torah. But that's only because you're not seeing the white space around the letters. You're not seeing the empty space. You're not appreciating the negative space. The negative space that's around the letters, that's the light that's coming in. Your generation, Moshe, was able to absorb more light. So I didn't need to put the crowns. The crowns are there so that I could block out some of the light and not blind the people. And so as each generation moved further from Sinai, the negative space is actually filled with ink because that space is where the sometimes blinding light comes in. This idea, it's an idea that takes a little time to digest, where we train our eyes not only to see what is, but to see what isn't. It takes some time. I'll just give you a little bit of an example about the is and the isn't. The entire time that we were in the desert, we may have seen ourselves as being in Galut. We were exiled. We were literally a man without a country. Israel wasn't our land yet, and Egypt was our land no more. And the entire time, from the time we left in Parashat Shlach in Sefer Shemot until we get into the land in Sefer Yehoshua, we were technically we could call it Galut. The word Galut is so beautiful because it means legalot. It also means a place of revelation. Galut, exile, is the place where God reveals himself to us. And in exile, what do? We define ourselves based on where we are not. The person in exile doesn't define themselves by where they are. If I am in exile, it means I am not home, or I am not wherever my place of being is. So the whole time that we're in the desert, we have an opportunity, and we're going to see this now, this is going to become a theme in Sefer Debarim, is do we see ourselves in exile? Do we see ourselves as lacking by virtue of not being where we should be? Or are we embracing this transition place, this ma'avar, this bridge, and are we embracing it to understand that the galut itself is an opportunity for revelation, for us to learn? Moshe learned a ton, and he tells us now he's an ish devarim. This experience helped him be able to express himself. And so a lot of this depends. Another thing that's interesting of Sefer Debarim, because we called it Kol Yisrael. I entitled the class, The Stories We Tell. It's the stories that we tell ourselves. Am I in exile? Am I in training camp? Am I on the way to something better? Am I looking backwards? Am I looking forwards? Is this the whole story? Is this me? Does this not identify me? Am I this, or is this just part of my story? A lot of this comes to play. And one of the things that Sefer Devarim does for us is it helps us decide. Now, first, it lets us do it to somebody else. It's always hard to look at ourselves in the mirror. But if we look outside, what can we see? We'll look at the people in Sefer Devarim. And we can ask, is this generation, are they the adults? Are they the ones that have now grown and matured, and they're a generation older, and they weren't yet 20 years old when the sin of the spies happened? And so therefore, they are now the adults. They've matured into adulthood, and they're going into, or are these the children? Are these the children of the older generation? So it's again, they're both, of course. On the one hand, they're the adults that are now grown. And on the other hand, they are the children of the earlier generation. And depending on how we choose to see ourselves in these situations, that's what's going to allow us to either move forward, be stuck in the past, and so forth. So let's look at these words first of all. One more thing I want to say about Ele HaDevarim, because I think it's important. As humanity, as a society, as a people, we had not cultivated the ability to be medaber. Something went wrong in the desert. What do? We cry, we nag, we scream. Do we dialogue? Do we have an intelligent conversation? If you started from the earliest, from Cain, when his brother's sacrifice is accepted and his isn't, and God tries to appeal to his logical brain, but of course he's so emotional that he can't even process what God is saying. In that whole encounter, there isn't a dialogue. Cain doesn't say a single word. He doesn't have a speaking part. God speaks to him, but he doesn't respond. The ability to dialogue, to speak, isn't yet developed. And we go through Yosef and his brothers. We could even go first to Yaakov and Esav. Do they sit down? Do they have a conversation? Do they say, hey, wait a minute, we made a deal. Remember the soup, the thing, the birthright. There's no dialogue. There's no meeting of the minds. There's no having a conversation. And the people who are best get the medal, the award for Dibur, believe it or not, and I'm smiling because I love them. The people who get this award are actually the daughters of Selofchad. Ken dobrot benot Selofchad. Ken, righteously, correctly, appropriately. Dobrot, what is God saying? Moshe, you could take a page from their book. Bnei Israel, you all could take a page from their book. They have an issue. They present this story. We learned about them a few weeks ago, so I'm not going to spend so much time on them. But as far
por favor. Esa escoba.
As the
para adentro. Hay otra azul para afuera.
Everybody, 1 second. Okay. did I mute myself too? No. As far as the daughters of Selofhad are concerned, God wants us to understand this is how we move forward in the world. We find our inner voice, we use our intelligence, and we move history forward. And so let's move. Speaking of moving forward, I want to talk a little bit about this ma'avar, this eved, this bridge. What does a bridge actually do? And I want to start to stretch your minds to think along the terms of not just a ma'avar, not just a bridge, which is a transitional passage. It connects the things that are unconnected. If we didn't have this bridge, if we didn't have this desert, we wouldn't be able to connect from Egypt to Israel. We wouldn't be able to connect. The idea in English is very generous. The language allows us to bridge ideas, to bridge concepts, to bridge people, to bridge objects. I would like for today, since we're spending so much time speaking about this word, I would like to go to the first place we see this verb appear. The ayin bet resh word, vaya'aver, is the first place that this word appears. It's, if you have Humashim, it's in Sefer Bereshit. It's in the 8th chapter. And what's so beautiful, I say this often, is this word never existed. And in order for this word to exist, it means that a new reality came to exist and we needed to call it something. We needed a word for it. So in chapter 8 in Bereshit, this first place where a ma'avad or a bridge or a passing or a crossing is described, Vayizkor Elohim et Noach, of course, the avar, the passing, the transitioning, is going to take place in the same area that the dibur, in the same story that dibur, that Devarim was created. You start to see the perfection of Torah, how words are born into families. And so you can't have the Vayidaber word without the Vaya'avor words. Those words go hand in hand. Those words are married to each other. Vayidaber takes place in this same chapter in verse 15, for instance, for the first time. So these words are created practically together. And the verse says, Vaya'aver Elohim ruach al ha'aretz, vayashoku hamayim. And so I should actually say that I should read the whole pasuk. Sorry, pasuk Aleph in chapter 8 starts, Vayizkor Elohim et Noach, Hashem, Elohim, remembers Noach and the Chaya, the Behemah that's with him in the Teva. And then he Vaya'avor. What does this word Vaya'avor mean? Does he pass? Does he breathe? It's hard to know. It's out. Whenever you come to the word for the first time, it's hard to have a frame of reference for what God did. But what he did was he avod, I'm using the Hebrew word for now, a ruach al haaretz, a wind, a spirit, a breath on the land, and the waters subsided or receded or became absorbed. So we have this word vaya'avor, this bridge that we're talking about today, or this ever hayarden, this other side. All of this is connected. Being on the other side of something, crossing over, a bridge, a passing. It doesn't hurt that we are called ivrim, the ones who have crossed over. Abraham was Abraham ha'ivri, he was me'ever hanahar, he was from the other side. So there's something in our DNA that has to do with this idea of vaya'aver. What is it exactly? I'd like to pinpoint it a little better. We have this imagery of breath, of wind, of spirit blowing over the waters. In this case, This is God remembering humanity and allowing us to survive and allowing the world to continue to exist. Let's start with that. And we know without air, without breath, without oxygen, we cannot exist. So the same oxygen that's going to come into the world in the time of Noah to allow us to exist is the same thing that Moshe is talking about. This Eved, this bridge, this other sideness, this, I'm going to use the word because the word is ruach, but it could be also read as revach, like a space. And we start to understand what Moshe is talking about here is what God was doing in the story of Noah when he saved us from the flood. And what was that exactly? That was God blowing his breath, his wind, his spirit, and allowing us to exist. He did it after the flood, and he did it in this Evet Hanahar Hayarden. That's what the Evet Hayarden was. If you want to look back on the scene after the 40 years and say, what was that? What did we just go through? You know what it was? If you understood it as the Evet, if we understand it as the Vaya'aved, if we understand it as the breath of God allowing for man to exist, then we start to understand the word revach, like ruach. Revach means space. And it's that space, again, that revach that's going to define us. The understanding that God is making space for us to exist, that he made space on the land, literally space on the land. He vaya'aved. That's why you need to see it in the Chumash so you could process it. It's, again, I read Perek 8, Pasuk 1. If I'm looking for something else, I'm not even paying attention to this word vaya'aved. I'm not even realizing that it's the first time that this word came into existence. But now in hindsight, and that's when most things happen, that's how we learn most things in hindsight, we turn back and we see vaya'aved Elohim ruach al haaretz. How does God allow for man to exist? He breathes, he passes a breath, a spirit on the land. And that's how we are able, in this space, is where we're able to recreate ourselves. In that space, we're neither here nor there. It's just an in-between. That's the place where we're able to become. And then once we see that, we see the word used as a verb for man. Of course, now you don't even have to guess. You'll probably, if we were live, you would probably just blurt it out. I know you would. If we wanted to see this avod, this idea, this concept of passing, when man does it first, of course, the first man who's going to do it is Avraham. He is the Ivri. We had said that, so maybe I gave it away. But if you could turn to chapter 12, verse 6, verse 1 starts with the famous Lech Lecha. This is Avraham making his journey. This is Avraham coming into himself, becoming his destiny. All these big things are happening in Parashat Lech Lecha in chapter 12. And then in verse 6, we see Vaya'avod Avram Ba'aretz. Avraham, it seems like, is going to pass into the land until Shechem, until Elon Moreh, and the Kanaani, by the way, is still in the land. And as we read this passage of Avraham, we start to understand that Avraham is an Ivri, just like we were Ovrim, just like we were passing over in the desert. Avraham, even in the land, was an Oved as well. And this is a very hard concept to swallow, Because if we have a hard, cold vision of a bridge, then we have point A, point B, and the bridge is just in the middle. But the Torah wants us to become flexible, flex our mind muscles into understanding that the bridge is constantly moving on us. You know, when they're constantly moving the finish line, the bridge is not just a one time and a one place. Vayavod Avraham ba'aretz, even in the land. How do I know that in the land he was neither here nor there? The pasuk tells us, because even though God promised him the land, Hakenaani az ba'aretz, the Canaanites are living in the land. And he himself, when he wants to bury his wife Sarah, what does he call himself? A ger vetoshav. There's an ambiguity to his identity, even when he's in the land. He's a ger, he calls himself. I am an outsider, but at the same time, I am a toshav. I am a resident. In English, they call it an alien resident. It's an oxymoron. Either you're an alien or you're a resident. Either you have rights or you don't have rights. Either you belong or you don't. But this idea of being an Ivri means that as a Jew, we have to constantly have this flexibility, this ability to transition from one reality to another, from one space to another, from one place to another, from one existence to another. And the biggest challenge, Moshe is saying now, as we come to Perashat Debarim, is knowing that these bridges are not our destinations. In the times that we're on a bridge, on a precarious bridge, let's not think of the gorgeous, the Verrazano Bridge or one of those big, beautiful bridges. Think more Tom Sawyer, you know, those rickety bridges, which was probably more similar to the bridges that we would imagine what the desert felt like. While we're on these precarious transitional passageways, we have to know that those are not our final destination. We have to develop as Ivrim, we have to develop a flexibility, because in the desert, the ones who thought that the transition was the destination, the ones who thought that the desert was the final point, was where they were ultimately going to end up. Look, you could live on peanut butter sandwiches if you know you're going to get to a place where there's going to be, normal cuisine for you. But they viewed the desert as their final place, as their final destination. So they complained about everything. If they knew that they only had to endure it for a short time and they would be in the land, and they would have been in the land. And Perashat Debarim talks about the defining factor, which was the sin of the spies, which we're now in the month of Av. We were coming to the 9th of Av, and you're going to hear time and time again about that sin of the spies. So I didn't want to spend so much time on it with you today, because I think you're going to get your fill of it this week. But regardless, the people in the desert who thought that the desert was the whole story, they never got to transition into the promised land. The ones who thought that the negative space was the whole picture, they never got to transition into the promised land. The women, the daughters of Selofchad, I'll use them as an example, they knew this was just a temporary situation, and they were campaigning for a future scenario that they knew that they would live to see, and they wanted to make sure that they had documentation and they had a certificate that said that when we get to the land, we're going to show that Moshe signed the certificate that says we get to inherit land even though our father isn't alive. That type of thinking, the type of thinking that this bridge is only temporary and there's a better place on the horizon, and we're going to live to see that better place, and that's what's going to help us get through this negative space. those people are the ones who end up being able to get there. And Moshe, as their leader, speaking of Erica Brown, I want to share with you, she uses a term, I thought it was beautiful. She uses the term aspirational postcard. She said, as leaders, so she uses Moshe, of course, because he was the leader of the people in the desert. And she said, it's the job of a leader to paint a picture, an aspirational postcard, meaning a picture that depicts a realistic view of what is, where this expedition is going to lead us. We want it to be fantastic, but at the same time, we want it to be realistic. We don't want it to be so out of the ordinary that the people can't process it. And she said an aspirational postcard is a vision. That's a big word that people use today. Leaders have to have a vision. But it's not just for the leader to have a vision, it's for the leader to be able to express or share the vision with everybody else so they'll come on board. And she says a cute thing. She says the aspirational postcard is as if it's saying, wish you were here. And that's the way that we understand it's somewhere where we wish to get, where we have to strive to get to. But ultimately, what Moshe did give them in the desert, in the parched wilderness, he gives them gushing rivers. He gives them these images, these visions of lush landscapes. We said we talk about the eretz, zavat, chalav, udvash. And the people complain in the desert and they say, you didn't bring us to an eretz, zavat, chalav, udvash. And in the stories they told themselves that the eretz, zavat, chalav, udvash was actually Egypt. And this is all in the text for you to see. And so Moshe, even though he tried to paint a beautiful picture for them, for some people it was a stretch for their imagination. They didn't develop the imagination to see and believe that that was on the other side of this bridge. But God still chose Moshe to be the one to take them. Moshe was the perfect person to be the bridge for them because he himself, his whole life, he was always the outsider. He names his son Gershom. I was an alien from the minute he was born. His identity was ambiguous. Was he a Jew or was he an Egyptian? Were those his brothers or were the others his brothers? And that disposition may have been what best suited him to move the people from one identity to another. He had to move the people from being powerless to being powerful, from being slaves to being kings, from being subjects of Paro to being objects of God, from being in a land of pyramids to being in a flat land of Sinai. And most of all, and here's the challenge, is he's moving them out of Mitzrayim, which was like a garden that was overflowing in the words of Lot back in the day, is to move them from a place that they thought was Gan Eden to a place that is going to be Eretz Yisrael, that he's going to say is going to be dry and arid. And you're going to have to hope and pray and depend on God for all of your water. And okay, so now this was just the introduction to Sefer Debarim. I wanted to put you in a mindset of where Moshe is at this point and where the people are at this point. Moshe is speaking to the second generation, but he's speaking to them as if they were the first generation. In retelling the story, he speaks to them and he tells them, let's look in, this way we will have looked in our Perashat and done a little bit of, look in chapter 1, look at verse 22. And this is just one example. Now, the people he's speaking to, I'll just say it again, they are the new generation. They are not the ones. He should be speaking in third person here, but he's not. He's speaking to them as if they are the ones who perpetrated all of these events. So if you look in chapter 20, verse 22, chapter 1, Vatikrevun elai kulchem. He's speaking to them and he's saying, and all of you approached me. Vatomru, and you all said, Nishlecha anashim, let's send men, lefanenu, before us. Vichapru lanu et haaretz, and let them spy out the land for us. Vayashivu otanu davar, and let them return davar, let them return either speech or something, proof. Et haderech asher na'aleba, let them guide us in which way we should go up. Ve'et ha'arim asher navo alehen, and which cities we should come to. I'm reading this verse for you. I want you to get a flavor that in Moshe's speech, he's speaking, now he's two Moshes. He's the Moshe who's the leader of the first generation. He's the Moshe who's the leader of the second generation. He himself has to transition his own identity and his own mode of leadership, because you can't speak to the first generation and the second generation with the same tone. Yet here, he's addressing them as if they were the same people. So on the one hand, he wants them to feel, to have a sense like the Haggadah, Avadim Hayinu Lefaro b'Mitzrayim. Were we really, us, all of us, slaves to Paro in Egypt? No. But do we want to get into that mindset? Yes. What Moshe wants here is for the people to get into the mindset. And this, by the way, there are volumes written about Moshe's account of the story and how inaccurate the account is. And for today, I'd like to say, I believe the purpose of Moshe bringing up the spy debacle was because he is telling these people, you today are standing at the precipice of coming into the land exactly as your predecessors were. Don't botch it up. Don't make the same mistake that they made. And in giving them this identity, he's also allowing, it's as if on some level, he's bringing the lost generation into the land by speaking to the new people as he would have spoken to the lost people. It's as if he's bringing both generations. You who said, let's send spies, you're coming in. I'm still speaking to you. I'm having the conversation with you here now as if you're alive, so that I could bring you or your memory, so that all of your actions weren't for naught. And one of the things that Moshe is also telling them, so that's nice because we are honoring the people who passed, who aren't going to make it into the land. But another thing that the Torah and Moshe is telling us is that fear often beats faith, that your fear governed, that your fear won out over your faith. And had you allowed for your faith to rule the day, we would have already been in the land. And this generation would have already been eating from the trees that you would have planted 40 years ago. And so when fear beats faith, what happens? The perceptions of the people get warped. Us too. This is, by the way, we know that it happened with them back then. And we know that they saw themselves now as grasshoppers instead of seeing themselves as kings. And then they took it to the next level, that everybody else saw them as grasshoppers. And then they took it, then everybody else was giants and they were tiny little bugs. We've seen a lot of that. But one of the, I think this is probably the most important part of what Moshe says, and it's so small that you might even miss it. And I think I'm going to use this to hopefully wrap all the pieces together. So we said that Moshe at this point is the person who is taking Torah and he is adding to the 4 books, and it's coming in a form of dialogue, and it's coming now from below to above. The Torah, which came from Har Sinai down to man, is now going from man himself, from Moshe, and he's bringing it up to the people from this point of the Aretz. He's bringing it up. But he uses for us, and I think this is the whole story. If you could only remember one thing today, I'd like you to see how Moshe describes. We're still in chapter 1 in Devarim, verse 5. Be'eved hayarden. So we spoke about this idea of the Eved, on the other side of the Yarden, on the side that isn't, on the side that's negative space, on the side that's the defining space that defines the other 2 objects. We got that. But then he says in Eretz Moav, Ho'il Moshe, Be'er et haTorah hazot. So here Moshe is going to teach the Torah, and he's going to say, Lemor, and here it is, Hashem Eloheinu diber Eleinu. God, Hashem Eloheinu, and we could go in forever to all of what the ramifications of that name of God means, where he partners with man. He's diber Eleinu, he dialogued with us. And then he uses this terminology and he says, Be-chorev. God spoke to us in Churev. And we're saying, what? What's Churev? Why are you calling Har Sinai Har HaElohim, Ha-Har? There's a million ways that you could describe Har Sinai. Why are you calling Har Sinai Har Churev? And if anything, Har Churev, what does Har Churev mean? What's a cherev? Why would I want to call the mountain of Sinai that I want to picture with all flowers and a chuppah of man marrying God and Shavuot and I have this gorgeous vision of Sinai. Why are you calling it the mountain of Chorev, of Churban, of Cherev, of sword? And I think this is Moshe's genius. He's going to call it Har Chorev, and we are going to figure out what he's saying very simply by going back to the beginning of Bereshit, by going back to the first place where that Cherev appears. And when we go back to that first place where that Cherev appears, let's see if I could find it quickly. It is go to chapter 3 in Bereshit, and we're going to end with this. Go to the last verse in chapter 3, where God had chased out Adam and Khabar from Gan Eden. Vaygaresh et ha'adam, vayashken mikedem legan Eden. He puts them to the east of Gan Eden. What does he put? The keruvim, the cherubs, and the lahat hacherev hamithapechet lishmor et derech etz hachayim. He takes an ever-turning sword and he puts it to guard, to protect the entryway to Etz HaChaim, to the tree of life. Now, if Har Sinai is being described as Har Chorev, what do we think Moshe is telling the people? He's saying, you misread the experience. You thought that if we would have listened to the word of God, that you would have died, as if a cherev would have killed you. That's how you saw Har Chorev. You saw it as something that was going to be your undoing, your churban. But Moshe is saying, did you know that Har Chorev is called that because that's where that Cherev, the one that is blocking the entryway to the Etz HaChaim, is located. The Matan Torah experience was intended to allow us to return, to turn the clock back to the Gan Eden experience. And Har Chorev was God's place where he was going to remove that cherev and allow you to enter and be embraced by the Etz HaChaim. That's what that was. And here we are today learning about Perashat Debarim, and we have to ask ourselves, are we able in these negative places, these negative spaces in our lives, in our history, in our journeys, are we going to allow the light to shine in, like Rabbi Cardozo's story with the light shining in the negative spaces? Are we going to realize that the negative space is an opportunity for the light to shine? Like the Midbar, which was a negative space, was an opportunity for God to shine his light. It was an opportunity for us to return to our idyllic existence. I pray today, this month, this year, this Av that is upon us, that our Galut will not be one in which we feel like we are not somewhere. We will focus all our attentions on where we are not. I pray that during our time of Galut, it will be a time of revelation, a time where legalot, where God is able, because we are open, to reveal himself. And I pray that the Galut that we are in is what creates the ma'avad, the bridge, so that we could transition to a Zion, to a Jerusalem, to an Israel that is Bishalom, that is a place of peace, that is a place that will complete us, and that we will all have the flexibility to be able to make these transitions with faith, without fear, and may that light shine on all of us together in Zion. Thank you for joining today. I am going to try and see if I can unmute you guys, unmute themselves. Let's see if you want to try. Let's see if you can unmute yourself. I think I did that. Mute upon entry, allow participants. Yeah, I think you can. All right. If anybody has any comments, feel free to share. Hi, Auntie Florida. I see her, but she's frozen. Oh, I see there's a chat. I forgot to check that. Oh, here we go.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and have a beautiful day. Hi, Katie's mom. I see you. I see you waving, but you're muted, so I can't hear you. I don't know how to unmute everybody. I knew Anna Ruth taught me. Let me see. Participants, come on. Rochelle, if you know how to unmute, if you're here with us. Oh, wait, here it says more. More. Don't mute all upon entry. Wait, got it. No, cancel. Cancel. I don't know. Anyway, I love seeing everybody. I'm sorry that we weren't in person. I see the kisses. Thank you. For some reason, oh, maybe my computer's not on voice. That could be happening. Hold on. Sound. I need to learn this. No, my computer's on sound. No, sound. I don't know. Anyway, everybody have a great day. I miss the hugs that we give to each other. Let me see. I see some people that know their computers. Can you see if you could unmute yourself? But why can't I hear any? Does anybody hear me? Shake your head if you hear me. I'm talking to myself. All right. Love you all. Have a great day. Sorry about that. Let's see. And then participants. Wait, choose unmute yourselves. Let's see. She's saying. And then participants and unmute themselves. Let's see. Allow participants to unmute themselves.
Now we're open. Thank you.
Oh, how did that happen? Hi,
Thank you.
Ma, can you hear me?
You did it.
It was all Esther Ruth. I thought it was Hannah Ruth. I mixed her up with Esther Ruth. Thank you, Esther Ruth. If you're on here somewhere, I don't know if you are, but thank you. She saves me every time. Well, everybody have a safe week, and let's hope that this Galut is going to be a beginning to a beautiful, beautiful bridge.
Rain. Thank you, Viv. It's Debbie. Have an easy fast.
Oh, hi, Debbie. I hear you.
Hi.
Yes. I see you on
I'm
the
not,
iPhone.
yeah, you don't see me, but yeah, thank you so much. I love
Yes.
it. Thank you. An easy fast.
Same to you. Same to you.
Thank you.
And hopefully the last one we have to do.
Amen.
Yes,
Amen.
yes.
Amen.
They say
Amen.
that this day will turn into a big, instead of a fast, it'll be a feast. We'll barbecue and it'll be a
Amen.
big party.
Amen.
You know what? There's still time. We still have a week, so you never know.
Yeah.
Sí. Okay,
Hi,
gracias, hablamos. Hi, Viv, am I open?
You're open. How you doing?
Okay, Baruch Hashem, I wanted to say something because you spoke about your art class and the
Yes.
space in
Oh, she's an
between.
artist. We have an artist in the house. Yes.
Because the space in between, when I teach drawing, I teach how to check your drawing by, which is what I learned, the negative space. That's how to check if your proportion is correct.
I only went to one class, so I didn't learn that yet.
Okay, wait. So in classical music also, when you listen to all music, folks, especially classical music, when you listen to classical music, the space in between each sound, the reprieve is something beautiful. In dance.
That's a great word. I'm going to use
I
that.
thought you'd like that. That was the first word I wrote. In dance.
I don't have a vocabulary to discuss.
I know. I wanted to say that. Wait, also in dance, before a dancer, when they're doing things, right? Or an athlete, they have to stop, collect themselves. Now, you were talking about time to regroup, to think, to focus, right? The intelligence.
I wish I called you before this. Regroup, refocus. I'm writing all this down.
Get your strength in that transition.
Oh, that's the whole class. I wish.
Yeah, Vin, you did such a job. You had me rolling.
I didn't know all that. I was like trying to get to say that, but
you got it. You got it. You did. You got everything. God bless you.
Rochelle, that was such a beautiful way to put it. I usually call my daughter-in-law, Simone, when I have like psychology questions. Now I'm going to call you with the art questions.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I wish everybody else was here to hear that. That was beautiful.
It was
great. Great class.
All right, everybody have a fantastic, I know we're in mourning this week, but let's use it hopefully for positivity and to get to a good place.
Amen.
Vivien?
Yes.
Learning with you will bring us joy this week.
Oh, you're so sweet. I love you. I really love, and I love, you don't know it, but your thing says Ima's phone. It makes me smile every time I see it.
When my son, how do you want me to set up your phone? Because my English name is Barbara Breitstein and I'm Bina, in Hebrew. So I said, do whatever you want. So he wrote down Ima's.
I love it. I think it's adorable. I think it's fantastic. It makes me, every time I see that little box that comes up that says Ima's phone, it makes me, don't change it. I won't know who you are.
And thank you for the fan.
How funny are you?
I'm still thinking about it. So I didn't forget.
You're so fun. Does it work? It was like a new one that didn't have blades.
Yes, it's so interesting. You charge it and then you press the button. You press the little thing, the button, and you put it right in front of you. And there are no blades. It's just air coming out. at you.
I wanted to ask you if you were able to figure it out, but I wasn't going to send you a conventional fan. That would have been no fun.
Well, every time I use it, you know who I think of.
I love it. Thank you.
Hi,
Thank
Vivien.
you.
It's Hannah Ruth. Can you hear me?
Who is that?
Hannah Ruth.
Oh, hi, Hannah Ruth. How are you?
Oh, Hashem. I'm always better after your shiurim because my life is very challenging.
God
But I
bless
want,
you.
well, yeah, God bless you. God blessed you. God blessed me with you. Anyway, I wanted to add that that when you rest after you exercise, that's when your muscles grow. If you don't
Ah,
Yes, the
rest,
Bastana. You're right.
True.
You're
yeah,
right. I don't know why I didn't put all that together.
if you don't rest, then you start to you can either grow very fat or you just start to lose muscle mass.
Oh,
I used to take a yoga class and they used to say the whole class, the most important part is that they called it Sabastana or something like that, where you
Rest.
Pose.
Yeah.
See, I don't know. I feel like I gave you I cheated you. I could have given it in a much better way if I remembered these things.
Not at all, Vivien.
Vivien, could
Yes.
I tell a story that I heard this morning from Michal Horowitz? She was telling a story about, oh, I can't see you anymore.
I'm here. I see
Oh.
me.
So she was telling a story from the Baal Shem Tov that he had a student who wanted to travel to Eretz Yisrael. So, you know, he went to ask the Baal Shem Tov for advice. So the Baal Shem Tov told him, the advice that I'm going to give you is be careful if anybody asks you any questions, be careful how you answer. I hope I'm going to say this right, but I'm going to do my best. So he went to visit all these places. And then one day he went to visit the Kotel. And this man approached him and asked him, what's your name? Where are you from? How are you doing? You know, where do you live? And he told him, and he said, how are you managing? So he said, well, it's very hard, but I'm managing. Okay. Finishes his trip. He comes back to the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov asked him, so did you meet anybody who asked you questions? He said, yes. He said, who was the last person that asked you a question? What was the question that he asked you? So he told him, and the Baal Shem Tov said, you fool. You should not have told him that you were managing. We're in Galut. You should have told him that we are not managing and we need Hashem to take us out of Galut, because the person you were talking to is Eliyahu Hanavi.
Oh my gosh.
Who had told him we're not managing. Maybe the next day we would have been taken out of Galut.
Wow. Wow.
I was thinking of
What a
that
story.
empty space when you were telling me about the empty space, looking at it, from the other. So that's what reminded me.
Wow. Wow. That's a powerful story.
Yeah.
Ay. All right. Anyway, everybody, have a beautiful day. Enjoy. Nice seeing you.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you.